personally believe is one of the few left dinosaurs of this old Sanskrit world. Uh, the creme de la creme you can have. Professor Madhav Deshpande, thanks for joining us today.
Well, thank you for inviting me. I'm definitely old, perhaps like a dinosaur.
But your memory is still good enough to tell some stories. This is where I would want to know, is it the usual way that a 10-year-old boy in Pune learns Sanskrit? Do all the boys in Pune learn Sanskrit, or there are...
In those days, in high school, we were required to learn 4 languages. Everybody was required to learn 4 languages. So Marathi was the state language, Hindi the national language, English, and then there was a theoretical option of a classical language. So Sanskrit was taught in those schools. A few places taught Ardha Madhavi, a few places taught in uh, and maybe Persian, but that was a rare thing. So Sanskrit was the most common fourth language that everybody had to learn. Uh, and then from the eighth grade up to 11th grade, everybody had to learn Sanskrit.
Mhm.
Marathi from first grade onwards, Hindi from fifth grade onwards,
Mhm.
and English also from eighth grade onwards. Everybody had to learn. So everybody would learn Sanskrit, but not with the same intensity.
Mhm. And your intensity came from where?
Okay. So what happened in my case, I think I may have mentioned to you that in my family, there was a memory of this great great grand uncle who became professor of Sanskrit. He got his master's degree from Deccan College in 1870s. Uh, his name was Professor Jinsiwale. Sridhar was his first name, Jinsiwale, and he became professor of Sanskrit in Mumbai. And when he passed away, he had no descendants, so all his books and his estate came to his sister, who was my great great grandmother.
Mhm.
So there was this memory of his that was continued uh, through my grandfather and through my father, and some of his books were preserved within the family. And my father had done his bachelor's degree in Sanskrit, so there was Sanskrit in the family. So when I was in my fifth grade in school, uh, my father took me to this Tilak Maharashtra Vidyapit, which was just a separate school that taught Sanskrit, and also they taught also English and some other subjects. But what they used to do is that, okay, you come here 1 hour a week, 1 hour a day,
Mhm.
and we'll teach you Sanskrit. And the benefit that was told is that in your school exams you will get better marks.
So the initial idea was of the marks.
Right, right. But I started going to this place when I was in my fifth grade and continued going there. But in my high school, the Sanskrit started at eighth grade.
Mhm.
So by the time they started Sanskrit in the high school, I had already done fifth, sixth, seventh grade, going to this Tilak Vidyapit every 1 hour a day. And so I was ahead in one subject, ahead of all other students, because I was also going there and I had already done 4 years of Sanskrit. So that continued until the end of my high school, that I was always ahead in that one subject.
Mhm.
So we had 7 subjects, so 4 languages, uh, physics, chemistry, mathematics. So we had to study all of this stuff. Uh, in our high school final exam, there was a statewide exam. Matriculation exam was a statewide exam.
Mhm.
And whoever got highest points in Sanskrit uh, got a prize. And this prize was called Shankar Sheth Scholarship, Jagannath Shankar Sheth Scholarship.
Mhm.
The scholarship was instituted in 1850s, and every year somebody would get it. And sort of there were big names in Maharashtra who had earned this scholarship, and sort of so there was the scholarship had very big name. So my teacher in high school sort of trained me to work hard for this Sanskrit exam, and I got that scholarship in that high school final exam.
Mm-hmm.
My grades in other subjects were okay, but not that great because I 90% of my energy into one subject, and all other subjects got 10%. And so it was clear that I was good in that one subject because I was already ahead by several years. So by the time I did my finished my high school, my Sanskrit was as good as like people who were finishing their bachelor's degree.
Mm-hmm.
Always, in that one subject, I was always ahead. And then I decided to, of course, my father had his degree in Sanskrit. His friends were all Sanskritists. So they pushed me to opt for Sanskrit as my college subject, which was not very common. Especially for boys, it was not very common. Because most boys would go to engineering, medical.
Yes, so it means Sanskrit is for someone who can do medicine or engineering. So it's not some choice you would want to go for yourself, right?
Right.
So it was your choice, or
It
it was
was
the
my
choice?
choice. It was my choice to go for Sanskrit.
Right.
So my Sanskrit classes in college were very interesting. So there would be like maybe 20 students, 2 boys and 18 girls,
Oh,
because it was considered okay for girls to do Sanskrit.
okay.
Because the consideration was that, getting a bachelor's degree for a girl would be good for her marriage,
Right.
and she wouldn't have to worry about getting a job.
Right. Because who will get a job with a Sanskrit BA? So means like nobody. It's a win-win. Like you have your education and you have some useless Sanskrit that you don't actually need for anything. Like
So, I was always told by my father's friends, which included S.G. Joshi, who eventually became my professor at the university,
right.
that don't worry about this. If you are very good at Sanskrit, there is always a job at the top. You will get a job.
So there was this concern that you won't get a job. So there was that idea that getting the education will get you nowhere, and you'll be like jobless, or the job will not be what a man would actually want to sustain his family.
Right. So I was told that you will definitely get a job. Don't worry about it. If you get such good grades,
right?
Because most colleges taught Sanskrit. Pune University taught Sanskrit. Deccan College had Sanskrit. So there were Sanskrit jobs, not a whole lot, but there were always Sanskrit jobs for students who were doing very well. So people like me, Ashoka Kluskar, who was a friend of me, he was 5 years ahead of me. And he was in a kind of similar situation, and he ended up getting a job. Of course, he came to US and went to Vancouver in Canada.
So your stories are a bit like, in many ways, have something in common.
Something in common. Something in common.
So then they said you will get a job, but what happened next? Okay, so you were doing all your energy went there. Were you thinking about the girls, about the 18 girls around, or you're a boy, not a monk? I mean, so how did it work?
Well, I mean, it was very tough because all girls around me were getting married, and I had to wait until I get my job at least.
So you couldn't be too speedy. You had to.
Right. So So when I was doing my master's degree at Pune University, uh, among several professors that I had, uh, Professor H.D. Joshi was the primary professor for Vyakarana. There was Professor Palsule, Professor Devasthali. They also taught Vyakarana. Professor R.N. Dandekar taught Veda. Professor Mehendale taught Nirukta. And so there were several different professors. But what was unique about Professor S.G. Joshi, not only that, he was my uncle, because he was a classmate of my father, and from my childhood I knew him. We were three students in his MA class. So one was me, one was Ruth Bergen, who worked with him to do translations of the Mahabharata. He was also my classmate. And then there was a girl, her name was Jayashree Gune. Eventually, she worked at the Deccan College for some time. Unfortunately, she passed away uh, rather early. So we were three students. And in the regular schedule of the university, there would be only 2 hours a week to teach Mahabhashya and to teach Paribhashendu Shekhara. And
Mhm.
SG insisted that it just wasn't possible to cover these texts just doing 2 hours a week. So he insisted that we go to his house every single day of the
And you
week.
went?
And we went, three of us. We would go to his house in the evening, whenever it was convenient for him, and he would teach us in 1 hour, 2 hours. And it was all free, of course. But there he would go into sort of great details of whatever we were reading, Paribhashendu Shekhara. I think those are the two texts I remember reading with him, Mahabhashya and Paribhashendu Shekhara. And I mean, for a single sentence in Mahabhashya, he would go on sometimes for a week.
A week, 1 hour, 2 hours per day.
2 hours in the regular schedule of the university, but at his home
Additionally, 2 hours plus, like, so it's like a 7, 8, 9 hours for one sentence.
for one sentence. He would do it because he would say you have to go into the depth of what's being discussed. For every single sentence of the Mahabharata is like an iceberg. You see only the tip of the iceberg in the text. There is like a whole iceberg underneath.
So what did he do? What did he do? He took different other texts or other parts of Mahabharata.
He
What
would
did
he would bring other parts of Mahabharata. Uh, he would bring, and of course, the most interesting thing and he was the unique professor. At some point, first he would explain Mahabharata, and occasionally he would strongly disagree with it. And he says, I completely disagree with this interpretation of Patanjali, which was very unique because, I mean, in the tradition of Pandit Shastri tradition, I mean, disagreeing with Patanjali is just simply unacceptable. But S.G. Joshi was unique because he started out as a Pandit and became a professor. I think I should tell his story briefly if you would like.
Yes.
How the transformation of Joshi happened.
So his story was not the usual way as well. So means he.
It was not a usual way. It was not a usual way. As a child, as a 6-year-old child, he was sent by his family from a village in Konkan, which is the coastal area of Maharashtra, to live with his uncle in Pune. His uncle was a Pandit, Sanskrit Pandit. And the Pandit, his uncle used to run a Pathshala.
So 6 years is the usual age when they started, means, or that's.
Well.
So you started later. I mean, you were
Right.
already 10. 10 is like, okay, he's 6.
As a sixth-year boy, I went to my first grade school, and then second grade, third grade regular school.
Right.
Here, Joshi as a boy came to Pune to live with his uncle, who was a Sanskrit Pandit, and he never went to regular school.
Mm-hmm.
He studied only with his uncle.
Mm-hmm.
So the 6-year-old boy is studying Sanskrit Shastras with his uncle. And as a very young boy, he passed exams like Vyakarana Tirtha. These were the exams from Bengal.
Mm-hmm.
He came out with flying colors, in those exams. As like a boy, 13, 14, 15-year-old boy, never went to regular school. Never studied English, never Hindi, no Marathi. I mean, because Marathi was his mother tongue.
Mm-hmm.
But never went to regular school. And then at the age of maybe 16, 17, something, he started teaching at that Pathshala. So a young boy became a teacher at the Pathshala, and he continued teaching until he was probably, something like 25 some years old.
Mm-hmm.
At that point, Professor Ingalls from Harvard went to Pune to spend some time, and he wanted to read Vyakarana with somebody. So people in Pune recommended that you should go and study with this young scholar. He doesn't know any English, but he's the best Pandit we have. So Ingalls read some Vyakarana with him in Pune and realized how brilliant he was, this young person. And he told him, okay, Joshi, if you get your bachelor's degree in Pune somehow or other, I will
Mm-hmm.
give you a fellowship to come to Harvard.
Mm-hmm.
So at that point, S.G. Joshi had not even gone to first grade. Okay. Never went to school. Never went to any regular school.
Right.
But in Pune, there was a sort of adult education school.
Mm-hmm.
So you study for 1 year and
Yeah.
appear for high school matriculation exam.
Right.
So S.G. Joshi went to that school in 1 year.
For 1 year, and he mastered all of it.
But you have to study 7 subjects. You have to do Hindi, English, Sanskrit, Marathi, physics, chemistry, math.
So he could not, as you, spend 90% of his energy only for Sanskrit. He had to spread it. Spread it.
He had to do all this.
Yes.
And he passed the matriculation. Then he came to college. When he was in college, some of his teachers used to consult him about what these texts mean. And there is one, again, interesting story. When he was in college,
Right.
one of our professors, Patwardhan, M.V. Patwardhan, he published his Shantarasa book, Shantarasa in Natya Shastra, with Jeffrey Mason. So Patwardhan was teaching Kavya Prakash of Mammata. And there was some passage there, and Patwardhan was teaching in a certain way, and Joshi raised his hand and said, I don't agree with this. So Patwardhan knew that, this guy is, good Pandit. So he says, okay, well, how would you explain this? So Joshi explained this in a completely different manner. So Patwardhan said, okay, why don't you write down your argument? So Joshi wrote down this argument, 3, 4, 5 page long.
Mm-hmm.
And Patwardhan agreed with him. Okay. And then eventually Joshi finished his bachelor's degree, got a fellowship to come to Harvard, and he did his PhD with Ingalls at Harvard. So to continue this story a little bit, when I was a student at Ferguson College, I had the same teacher, Patwardhan. And Patwardhan was teaching the same text, Kavya Prakash. And he explained this passage, and I was sitting in the classroom. I raised my hand, and I
didn't knew about the story, so it was like it was
I didn't
repeated.
know anything about this story.
Right.
I didn't know anything about this earlier story.
Right.
I raised my hand and I said, I don't agree with this.
Oh my! It's impossible. I mean, it's a coincidence that it's impossible in real life.
So Patwardhan says, I had consulted Joshi when he was my student, and he wrote this long argument, and he gave this written document to me.
Right.
Okay, why don't you look it over And if you disagree with this, write down your own argument. So, as a student, I wrote down a kind of counter, a khandana of S.G. Joshi. Okay.
So you disagreed not with him, but with Joshi.
Right. I
Okay.
mean, because Patwardhan was following Joshi's argument.
Right. So he had already abandoned his own arguments.
Right.
He had.
Right. So I wrote this khandana of S.G. Joshi. And S.G. Joshi was a big,
Right.
he had returned from Harvard. He was a full professor at Pune University by
Right.
then. And personally, he was like an uncle to me.
Right.
A journal in Pune published both of these documents. They published S.G. Joshi's document as well as my document.
Right.
And Joshi was furious. I said, how dare you contradict me? What do you know? Do you know anything about this? Okay. And he came to our home and said to my father, your son is so audacious, how dare he to write this? Okay. And then I kind of just, I said, well, I wrote this and I published this. Okay.
So it means it's not always just sunshine. It means sometimes there are stories, even with people whom you know, other than from the books, that it's not always milk flowing. There are stories behind the story.
Right. So eventually, of course, at Pune University, he became my professor. And while I was doing my master's degree, he had already sent Ashok Akluskar to Harvard.
Mm-hmm.
And Joshi's idea was to train his students in both ways, Western academics and Indian academics.
Because he himself went through it.
He himself went through that. And he could see the value of doing this dual education. So he sent Akluskar first. And then when I was doing my master's degree, he suggested the same thing to me. He said, you should apply to, and then he suggested University of Pennsylvania was one, the other was Yale, and the third one was Columbia University. So I applied to these three places. I got admission to all these three, but University of Pennsylvania offered me a 4-year fellowship.
Mm-hmm.
And so I decided to come to Pennsylvania. And then, of course, at that point, I had the fellowship at Pennsylvania, but no money to travel.
Right.
And the cost of travel was 5,000 rupees, which was more than my father's annual salary.
Mm-hmm.
So the question was, how do I raise this money? And S.G. Joshi himself didn't have any money in that amount. Because in those days, maybe his salary was like 500 rupees a month, some salary. So how do you raise 5,000 rupees? So finally, sort of after investigating different alternatives, I found this foundation in Pune, which supported students in their higher education. And so I applied there, and when I was interviewed, they said, okay, well, we are willing to give you a loan for travel for 5,000 rupees if you want to fly by air. But if you are willing to go by a cruise, a cargo ship, we can arrange a free travel. So I said, okay, why borrow money? So I was willing to travel by ship. And so I got this free travel on an Indian cargo ship from Cochin in Kerala to New York.
But you didn't went alone.
There were 3 students, a total of 3 students.
Okay.
On the cargo ship. What used to happen on the cargo ship is that at the top deck, there were 2 cabins. There was a captain's cabin, and then there was something called owner's cabin. And all other crew members' cabins were on lower decks.
Mm-hmm.
They couldn't put anybody else at the same level as the captain.
Mm-hmm.
And that owner's cabin used to go vacant.
Mm-hmm.
So the shipping company thought of this idea that to give that owner's cabin to 3 students as free child,
Mm-hmm.
as a scholarship. So we went from Pune by train to Cochin. My father came with me, and I boarded the ship. And the ship took 1 month
Mm-hmm.
because in 1968 the Suez Canal was closed, and the ship had to go all around South Africa
Mm-hmm.
to reach New York. And so I reached New York. Somebody came to pick me up at the docks, and I took a train to Philadelphia. I reached my department. I had at that point I had $50 in my pocket. I had collected $50 in India from various friends, and uh, when I reached my department, University of Pennsylvania, my question was, uh, when do I get my first month's fellowship? So
I want some food.
their answer was, don't worry, you will get it at the end of the month. Now, I reached there by the beginning of September,
Right.
and they said, you will get this at the end of the month. So with $50, what am I going to do? So again, as circumstances would help me. There were several students from Pune who were,
Already there.
who were studying in Philadelphia, and I had some contacts with those students. So from my department, I went to the apartment of one of those Pune students, and I told them this is what has happened. That I have only $50, and my fellowship I will get at the end of the month. So then there were 6 students from Pune living in the same building,
Mm-hmm.
and they were doing degrees in engineering, pharmacy, whatever others. Nobody in my field,
Mm-hmm.
but they collectively took care of me. They collectively took care of me and said, "Okay, until you get your fellowship, we will pay for your apartment, we'll pay for your food. Don't worry about this." And so then this is how I started sort of at Pennsylvania.
So when you went there, you already had your topic, or your topic came later? So means you knew
Well,
what you will do there?
when I joined this department, the department was called Oriental Studies, and it covered from Egypt to Japan, and sort of Sanskrit in India was one part of that Oriental Studies. And
It was already there. For how many? Sanskrit was a field already for how many years there in Philadelphia? Like
uh, probably 20, 30 some years, the department was already there. Uh, Professor Norman Brown was the earlier professor at that department. Norman Brown, who published on Veda and some other. So when I joined that department, the chairman of the department was a Sanskrit professor. His name was Ludo Roche, Professor Ludo Roche.
mm-hmm.
And Ludo Roche's field was Dharma Shastra. And there was another professor, George Cardona. And Cardona was in the Department of Linguistics. But he was also teaching in this Oriental Studies. So when I went there, it was Oriental Studies who had given me this fellowship to go there. So the first suggestion came from Professor Ludo Roche, and he suggested that I could do Dharma Shastra with him. That was one possibility. But I had been doing Vyakarana for so many years in Pune as my primary subject. And I knew that Cardona was also there. So I then decided to work with Professor Cardona. And I took some courses with Ludo Roche as well, but my main advisor then became Cardona.
Well, the first time you saw him, was it like you understood he's the one, or it did take time for you to learn each other? So what was the relationship?
It it was somewhat uh, difficult in the beginning because from Pune, uh, the relationship of S.D. Joshi and Professor Cardona was not exactly harmonious. In the sense, I'm not, I'm not saying personally they didn't
Right,
like it, but
right.
academically they had disagreed with each other
Okay,
in their publications.
right.
So, working with Cardona initially, I was a little bit apprehensive, but uh, very soon he and I sort of were on the same tune. Uh, I found that he had studied Sanskrit with Pandits in Banaras for several years, and so he was like a Banaras Pandit.
Mm-hmm.
Professor Cardona was very sharp. I mean, he's still he's very sharp, and uh, if I ask some question, the answer can just split second. The
Question
answer is there.
from the field of linguistics mostly, or question mostly on the field of Vyakarana? So what?
With Cardona, I studied mostly Vyakaran,
Mm-hmm.
but I had to do multiple courses as part of this course requirement for PhD. So I took what really took me to linguistics were couple of different things. One thing was I took courses in historical linguistics. So there was a professor named uh, Henry Hönigswald. Henry Hönigswald was a historical linguist, uh, and I took historical linguistics with him. And I remember, my first some classes, I was taking down notes in Sanskrit. It was so interesting. I mean, he's teaching linguistics in English, and I'm writing down some notes,
All
because
right,
I was quite used to taking down notes in Sanskrit,
right.
and I wrote my term papers for historical linguistics on subjects connected to Sanskrit,
Mm-hmm.
and so that was kind of my introduction to historical linguistics. Then Chomskyan linguistics had just come up,
Mm-hmm.
but the Department of Linguistics at Pennsylvania was not teaching Chomskyan linguistics
Right,
at that point.
right,
They were still teaching pre-Chomskyan
right.
structural linguistics. And Chomskyan linguistics course was offered in electrical engineering
Hmm.
by a professor there. So again, I took that class,
You
and
took it because you were interested in linguistics, or
because I was interested in linguistics. So, and this was just this is the very first book of Chomsky, Syntactic Structures.
right?
That was the book, that was the textbook for that class. And it was taught in historical linguistics. Uh, and then the other class in linguistics I took, I remember, was uh, philosophy of language. And that was a very useful class for me. Because again, in Pune, I had taken Western philosophy as one of my classes.
Mm-hmm.
And so that was like a survey of Western philosophy from Aristotle and Plato to Bertrand Russell, like a very quick survey. So I had some background of Western philosophy. And I took this class in uh, philosophy of language. That also helped me sort of focus on what I wanted to do for my dissertation. So after discussing with Cardona, I decided to work on this text of Kaunda Bhatta uh, called Vyakarana Bhushana. And Vyakarana Bhushana is more like semantics of language. So all the different parts of language, what are their meanings?
Mm-hmm.
The debates about meanings of those. So verb roots, uh, particles, affixes, uh, nouns. There are separate chapters by Kaunda Bhatta. on so meaning of nouns was something that I picked as a chapter for my work. And when I was working on that chapter, as I started reading it, it was very clear that he is doing like a summary of arguments going all the way back to Patanjali
Mm-hmm.
and then coming down to Shabara, Bhashya, and Mimamsa, Nyaya Bhashya, the Navya Nyaya, Ekas Gangesha, and then coming to 16th century and all the 16th century debates, and then consolidating his view as sort of, Counter Bhatta's view at the end of the whole discussion.
Mm-hmm.
So, so working on that text kind of, in a way, forced me to look up all the same topics, uh, debates on meaning, going back to Patanjali and Mimamsa. Luckily, again, Professor Matilal was teaching at University of Pennsylvania. He taught there for 1 year.
Mm-hmm.
And I had the opportunity to study with him for 1 year. A text in Navya that was connected with this theory of meaning.
Mm-hmm.
The text called Shaktivada, debates over Shakti of a word, the ability of a word to communicate meaning.
Mm-hmm.
And so Shaktivada presented, of course, the view of the Nyaya system. And here was Counter Bhatta rejecting the views of Nyaya and establishing sort of the Vyakarana view.
So this is the time you started looking around, other than Vyakarana, what is
Right,
there?
right, right. And so Professor Thieme was there for 1 year when George Karduna was on leave for 1 year.
Mm-hmm.
And so with Thieme we read Panini, and it was again very revealing how Thieme looked at Panini in a kind of really historical way, saying, okay, this is what Panini says. This is what Katyayana says. Are they saying the same thing? If they disagree, why do they disagree? Where do they disagree? Is it change in just theory? It's a change in language.
Mm-hmm.
And again, looking
So
at
he was trying to bring the historical perspective there.
he brought his historical perspective, and then as sort of part of his class, he made us read his writings uh, on Panini, uh, which had followed kind of similar historical path of working on Panini. And so uh, for him, I had to write term papers for all these classes, for different classes. So the paper that I wrote for Thieme was the Tapara Karana in Panini. So Panini attaches this marker, ta, to vowels.
Mm-hmm.
To say, if you say in Panini, that can stand for a, prolonged a, the whole range.
Right.
But if you say at, then it stands only for short vowels.
Mm-hmm.
So there are numerous sort of very complicated issues surrounding this attachment of the. And initially, I want to write something about this. He says, okay, so write a draft and show it to me. So I had taken a sample of rules in Panini,
Mm-hmm.
maybe 10, 15 rules,
Mm-hmm.
and written something, said, well, what does this the do in these rules? What does it? And so I gave this draft to Professor Thieme. And 2 days later, I had to go see him. And he says, okay, well, this looks okay, but this is just the beginning. Okay.
You were thinking it's the end.
What does Panini do in the rest of the Ashtadhyayi? Unless you look at the rest of the Ashtadhyayi, you cannot make any conclusions.
Mm-hmm.
Your conclusions based on 10 rules,
Mm-hmm.
they may or may not stand.
Mm-hmm.
When you look at the rest of the Ashtadhyayi. So go back and look at the rest of the Ashtadhyayi. Okay.
By that time, did you learn Ashtadhyayi by heart already many years ago?
I had studied Ashtadhyayi in Pune.
But not by heart. Study, but not by heart, it means.
I had memorized quite a lot of Vyakarana.
Mm-hmm.
by that time because of my training in Pune.
Right.
Because in Pune, S.D. Joshi was one teacher and Bhagavad Shastri, I continued studying. Simultaneously, I was going to Pune University and to Tilak Vidyapit. Tilak Vidyapit, where Bhagavad Shastri taught me Vyakarana in a more traditional way. And so simultaneously, I had done this Vyakarana on both tracks. So reading like the basic commentary on Panini, Kashika Vritti, for example, was not very difficult. But so I had to go, what Professor Theme, I had to go through every rule that has ditta, and then I showed him, okay, so here is this modified draft, and I have looked at all rules. But Panini has ta. He says, but you haven't looked at rules where he doesn't use the. So go back and look at those rules where it, and you have to contrast the rules where he uses it and where he doesn't. Then you will know why he uses it here and why he doesn't use it. Okay. So I
Did you
go
understood after what he means, why he did what?
right, right. So he made me revise that paper 3 times.
So he was not making fun of you.
No, he wasn't making fun of me, and he knew that I could read this. But I think what I learned from him is that if you want to assert a conclusion about something, unless you look at the as wide data as is available to you, any conclusion that you make based on a few examples likely won't stand.
Right.
It won't stand. And at the end of my 3 revisions, Professor Thine was so happy. He said, "Okay, can I take it back to Germany and publish it?" Okay. And he published it in a journal he was editing there. That was
Mhm.
really my first academic publication. This procedure of Taparakarana. It was published in, forget what the name of the, Vergleichende Sprachforschung.
So yes, so it's all about comparative linguistics. Means this is the field where he got you in. Means like bringing the historical perspective. So and from there on, your main research, your main field is What is your main field?
Yeah. So what happened? Okay, it's a good question. So what happened when I finished my PhD? For 2 years, I was focusing on Kaundabhatta and theories of meaning from Patanjali to Mimamsa to Nyaya to Kaundabhatta. And then Nagesha Bhattu comes slightly after Kaundabhatta and contrasting those two. That was my complete focus for 2 years. After finishing my PhD, when I was just about finishing, I was getting letters from S.D. Joshi and from Pune. Don't stay there. Don't stay in America. Come back. I sent you to get trained there, but not to stay there. Okay, just come back.
Mm-hmm. Because
we want you to come here and teach the next generation.
Okay, he wanted you to become a teacher there, not
right.
not
right.
in America.
Right. And says we will get you a job. We will have a job for you. Don't worry. Come back. So after finishing my PhD, I was married by that time. So my wife and we returned to Pune within about like 10 days.
Mm-hmm.
So it was like beginning of something like June of 1972. I returned to Pune. And I went to see Professor Dandekar, who was the head of the department at Pune University.
Right.
S.D. Joshi was away in foreign country somewhere. So Professor Dandekar says, yes, we want to hire you, but we have to go through all the regular procedures. A job has to be advertised, and it will take about a month.
Mm-hmm.
So you just wait for a month. So I said, okay, I will wait for a month. And I went to see my in-laws. I had never met my in-laws.
Mm-hmm.
So I got married in Philadelphia, and my wife came from Pune.
Right.
And so I never met my in-laws. So I went to, in 2-3 days, The news came from Pune that Pune University had gone into a deep crisis.
Hmm.
The vice chancellor of Pune University was fired for some financial. I don't exactly know what had happened,
Mm-hmm.
and a new vice chancellor was appointed. And the first rule that he made was total ban on all hiring, to freeze all hiring.
Right.
So in 4 or 5 days, I returned to Pune and I go to see Professor Dandekar, and he says, "This has happened now. So what to do?" So then, there was a 1 year job in a local college
Mm-hmm.
available to me. So I said, okay, I will take that job. Somebody else had gone on leave, and so there was an open job for 1 year.
Right.
So almost like beginning of June, we reached India. 15th of June, I started teaching at this local college.
Because you were hoping still you will be able to get into the Deccan College or into the Pune
Pune
University
University,
later.
right, right. So I took this Sanskrit job at a local college, started teaching there, and end of that month, I got a telegram. This is an interesting story. I got a telegram from an American classmate of mine.
Mm-hmm.
He had finished his PhD at Penn and got a job in Michigan
Mm-hmm.
in linguistics. His name was Peter Hook. I don't know if you've heard him.
Yes, I know him. Yes.
Peter Hook.
Right.
So
He's rather bright as well.
I got this telegram from Peter Hook saying,
Right.
we are trying to reach you on phone
Right.
in Pune. It's very important to talk to you. So go to this address and wait for our phone call. Because my
Right.
family did not have a phone.
Right.
And he knew my Indian roommate from Pennsylvania. So he said, go to his family in Pune,
Mm-hmm.
wait for our phone call.
Mm-hmm.
So I get this phone call from Michigan. And Peter Hook says, Madhav, we have a job for you. Okay.
So from time to time, somebody calls you and says, "We have a job to you," and you go there, and not always you get a job, but they call from time to time.
Right. So the chairman of linguistics says, oh, our Sanskrit professor just left. He hasn't yet resigned, but he has gone to University of California.
Right.
And we have urgent need to fill it. And in the meantime, they had, because of Peter Hook, they got in touch with Cardona, got a hold of my dissertation. They had looked at my dissertation and said, okay, well, this guy is okay, we can hire him. And says, we want to offer you this job. Will you come back? We'll pay your travel and your wife's travel. And for the first year, it will be a visitor's job, and then it may become permanent.
Mm-hmm.
At the moment, it's 1 year visitor job at Michigan.
Mm-hmm.
But there was a possibility of becoming permanent there.
So, what was your thought? Were you thinking of remaining there at Pune, waiting for something, or?
So my choice in Pune was to wait for a year in Pune,
Right.
see what will happen there,
Right.
or take the job in Michigan and see what happens there.
Okay.
Okay. So my calculation at that point was purely financial. That if I work for 1 year in Michigan, whatever I will save, and suppose I come back to Pune,
Right.
I will have some balance in my bank.
Right. You still were thinking that you will come back to Pune sooner or later.
Right. So then I come back to Michigan, and this was in the Department of Linguistics. So Sanskrit was taught in the Department of Linguistics at that point.
So it means you have changed your. Before that, you were like putting linguistics into Sanskrit, and now you are putting Sanskrit into linguistics.
Exactly. So here I was now in the Department of Linguistics. So I started teaching Sanskrit there. At the end of the first semester, so from September to December, the first semester, End of December, Professor Jaini, who was my predecessor there, he resigned.
Mm-hmm.
And I thought then this job will become permanent.
Right.
But as again, circumstances would have it, there was a financial crunch at Michigan.
So wherever you came, there was some financial crisis.
Right. So at Michigan, every department had some allocation of a budget cut.
Right.
So so this linguistics thought that this professor has now resigned, so we will trade this position for budget cut.
Right.
So they told me that okay, well, we are so
It was
sorry.
nothing personal. It was just
Right. So it says okay, we are so sorry. We will pay your travel back. We will pay for the cost of your travel back. That they had promised that. So in January I start teaching the next semester. My wife and I both thinking, now we are going back to India. In end of April, we'll go back to India.
mm-hmm.
Somewhere around February, sometime, the chairman of linguistics comes to my classroom. I'm teaching Sanskrit. Knocks on the door. Says, Madhav, can you come out? So I said, everybody calls everybody by first name. Nobody says Professor so and so. Okay. This is America. Okay. So, please come out. So I said, so what happened? So he said, I came out from a meeting and a job has opened up today. And I need to know right now, do you want to stay in Michigan or do you want to go back to India? Because he had to go back to that committee meeting and tell them. And in those days, as you can imagine, there were no cell phones, nothing. And he wanted to know right there whether I wanted to stay.
You could not even consult your wife or tell the story, nothing like
that. Wife, anything, okay. So I said, okay, I mean, what are my good options? So I said, okay, yes, I want to stay here. So by that evening, I had a letter of permanent appointment at Michigan. And there was one condition, and that condition was that another professor was leaving town that very day. And I had to teach his classes for the remaining of the semester. There was some class in linguistics. I don't exactly remember what it was, but it's so long ago. Some historical linguistics, something.
Right.
So I had to teach that class to the end of the semester. And I said, okay. And I would ask him, why is this colleague leaving? And nobody would tell me. Nobody would tell me. And several years went by, and then it came out that this colleague had stolen a painting from the university and sold it to some dealer, and then he was caught. That was the day he was fired.
Right.
And I was hired.
Right. So sometimes a robbery can bring in some change in the life of other people as well.
Absolutely.
So it was mostly unexpected. You were ready to move wherever you were wanted, and there was no planning for like 10 years or 20 years. It was like, okay, I'm going for this semester, and then I'm ready to get back.
Right. And then being at Michigan for almost first 12, 13 years, I was in this department of linguistics. So that sort of reoriented me more and more toward linguistics.
Towards where Time came from, or Cardona, whom you would...
Cardona was, of course, in Pennsylvania, but my new environment of being in linguistics, in the department of linguistics, where all colleagues, see, every week, we had a kind of a pattern of every colleague had to give a presentation on whatever research they are doing. Okay. So, somebody is giving presentation on sociolinguistics. That was a newly emerging field at that time. Or historical linguistics. Chomsky and something. Okay, giving. Now, when my turn comes, who is my audience there? Not there is not a single Sanskritist except Peter Hook who knew,
Right.
Sanskrit. He was the only person. No one else in the linguistics department knew any Sanskrit. Standing in front of them, if I have to talk about Panini, I have to make Panini comprehensible to an audience of linguists, not Sanskritists, but an audience of linguists. And so a good deal of my publications came out of these presentations that I had to give to an audience of linguists, and, and then trying to make issues in Sanskrit grammar. Uh, and then slowly sort of I got into historical linguistics, sociolinguistics of Sanskrit. But all of those things were uh, because of this environment of being in linguistics. And that was, uh, it kind of took me away from other aspects of Sanskrit. Because in Pune, I used to write poetry, for example.
Mm-hmm.
I had written some Sanskrit dramas in Pune. I
Right.
put them on stage. I used to act on stage in Sanskrit dramas. All of that sort of went on complete back burner because
Right.
there was no audience for that. But there was audience for linguistics if I could make issues of Sanskrit comprehensible to an audience of linguistics.
Were you able to make them comprehensible?
To a large extent. Maybe not absolutely 100%, because at some point, if you're discussing Panini, the nuts and bolts of Panini become rather difficult for someone who hasn't studied Panini to understand.
Did you understood yourself something better trying to explain it to them?
Indeed, indeed, it helped me quite a bit. And what it allowed me, most of all, is to start looking at Sanskrit not sort of in and of itself, not sort of purely from within the Sanskrit tradition, but Sanskrit as a language. If you can look at linguistics of Greek, linguistics of Latin, why not look at Sanskrit? You can look at Sanskrit from a more wider perspective. That if you make a statement about Sanskrit, will that be applicable? Can that be generalized to some other language? Can that be generalized even to other Indian languages, let alone other non-Indian languages? So that environment of being in linguistics really made me think of, okay, uh, how would I explain this? I mean, for example, there was an old colleague of mine. His name was Kenneth Pike. He was very serious senior to me. Was a very famous phonetician of his days. And sort of looking at issues of Sanskrit phonetics, reading Pratishakya. I was reading Pratishakyas with some of my students. And issues of Pratishakyas I would take to him. And he did not know any of this Sanskrit stuff. But he would say, okay, to make sense of this Pratishakya to a phonetician, how would you translate it? So, for example, the Pratishakya says, if a sparsha sound, a stop comes before another sparsha, it changes to something called abhinidhana. This is one good example. Abhinidhana is where the stop is your closure but no release.
Mm-hmm.
So suppose you have atta, atta. Now we think of two thas, but those two thas are not exactly phonetically the same.
Mm-hmm.
The first tha is unreleased, and it's only the second tha that opens up.
Mm-hmm.
So what that means is that closure you hold for a longer time, and then you open up.
Mm-hmm.
Reading Pratishakya alone did not give me this clarity.
So the questions you got from the linguists were making you aware of making the topic look like a bit different. So
Right. So, I mean, in the office of my this phonetician colleague, he had even these models of of the oral track, like it says, okay, moving tongue and moving. And it says, okay, when you say "ko," what happens? So you show me,
So you had like a photos of where you have the tongue, or you were just showing it on yourself? Like what was?
He had this physical model.
Yeah. So you showed it on the model where your tongue is.
He would show me on the model. So he said, well, when he said "ta," what happens to this internal organ? What is touching what, So that kind of clarity, I did not have studying Panini Shiksha or Pratisakya in Pune. Because in Pune, it was all oral, verbal teaching, and the teachers did not have this kind of background of modern physiology or phonetics.
So physiology was not involved in the Shiksha in the Pune.
Right. Because I had not studied linguistics in Pune. Our department of Sanskrit did not have courses on linguistics.
Yes, because it was not there. You didn't study because it was not there.
Linguistics was taught at Deccan College.
Mm-hmm.
See, if you have been to Pune.
Yes. I mean, it's not far anyway, but.
So linguistics department was at Deccan College.
You're right.
And to do a master's degree in Sanskrit, theoretically you could take linguistics, but then for that linguistics you would have to travel to the other end of the town.
Right.
And come. So they would say rather, okay, so I had taken Pali as my secondary subject.
Okay.
So I did Sanskrit Vyakarana as my primary. Then I had to study, of course, Rigveda. Everybody had to study some of those other subjects.
Mm-hmm.
And then a secondary subject was Pali for me.
Did the Pali start? Okay, it seems our time is over, but I would next time maybe then I would start asking you: did the Pali studies actually help you look from the side what's happening in the field of Sanskrit? Because what I've seen and read from you makes me feel that the other subjects made you aware of the issues that you cannot become aware looking from inside the Sanskrit field of Vyakarana.
Exactly. That is absolutely the case. That is absolutely the case.
I hope there are issues to continue. I am thankful that you have mentioned about 3 out of maybe 20 persons or 30, which I would want to hear the story about. I want to hear the untold story of Professor Madhav Deshpande, how he became what he is, and what are his interests. Because, I mean, the social linguistics, it maybe was new at the days where you were there in the university, but the topics are still in my head. I mean, I still have the questions. I mean, the answers, they don't make me feel like that there's an end of. I mean, they raise more questions. The answers you have given, they not made me like satisfied. Like they made me ask more questions and I don't know if there is an end to Vyakarana. I do not know. I guess no, but
it's an ongoing process of thinking over issues, and something that I may have thought 50 years ago, I may think completely differently today.
Yes, so let's have the story of the last 50 years in the Sanskrit field. And thanks for your time. I hope there will be another time and place where we can continue the story of Madhav Deshpande.
Thank you.
Goodbye.
Thanks.
Anatoly.